Hello. What does the holiday of Shavuot commemorate? The Talmud says, quote, Rabbi Lazar said, Shavuot is the day on which the Torah was given. The sages taught on the sixth day of the month of Sivan, Shavuot, the Ten Commandments were given to the Jewish people, unquote. And that's why we were taught. But that's not in the Torah itself. The holiday is called Shavuot, meaning weeks, because of the 7 weeks of the counting of the Omer, beginning on the second day of Pesach. The Torah says only that it's an agricultural festival. Indeed, it's also called Hag HaBikurim, the feast of the first fruits, and Hag HaKatzir, the feast of the harvest. It celebrates the season of the grain harvest in Israel, which lasted 7 weeks, beginning with barley on Pesach and ending with wheat 7 weeks later. It was a happy time, celebrated by great communal rejoicing and a feast. Work restrictions applied, as for Shabbat and other holidays. So why the disconnect? The reason is tied in part to the long-time feuds between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. We will describe them and their feud later. Let us begin with their disputes over the date of Shavuot. While the Torah talks about Pesach, it says that Shavuot should start the day after Shabbat. Quote, and from the day after Shabbat, you shall count for yourselves 7 weeks. They must be complete, and their end marks the beginning of Shavuot. End of quote. It says the day after Shabbat, but to which Shabbat is it referring? The Sadducees interpreted the phrase literally to refer to the Shabbats within Pesach. Pesach lasts 7 days, so it must have a Shabbat in it. The Talmud reports that an elderly Sadducees said to the top Pharisee, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, quote, Moses, our teacher, was a lover of the Jewish people, and he knew that Shavuot is only 1 day. Therefore, he arose and established it right after Shabbat to allow the Jewish people to enjoy themselves for 2 days. End of quote. So the Sadducees believed God added a day to Shabbat to give the people a full weekend off after their hard labor in the fields. This did not fly with the Pharisees, the rabbis. They said that if the Shabbat in the verse is the Shabbat in the week of Pesach, then its date will vary from year to year, and so will the date of Shavuot. They believe that since all other Jewish holidays have specific dates, so should Shavuot. So they decided that the Torah means that the Shabbat in question is the first day of Pesach, interpreted as a Shabbat, meaning a day of rest, which it is also. This gives Shavuot a fixed date, the 6th of Sivan. Many rabbis in the Talmud propose many proofs that the Shabbat in question is the first day of Pesach. They did not explain why the Torah phrased it that way, although they pointed out that the Torah does occasionally refer to a holiday as Shabbat. The intensity of the dispute is openly displayed. Facing the elderly Sadducee was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the greatest Pharisee of his generation, the man who would save Judaism after the fall of the Second Temple. He called the elderly Sadducee a fool who prattles with frivolous speech, and added, and if Moses, our teacher, was a lover of the Jewish people, as you just said, why did he delay them in the wilderness for 40 years? The elderly Sadducee said to him, my teacher, you dismiss me with this retort? The retort was indeed weak, seeing that the Torah says that God, not Moses, decided on the 40-year trek in the desert after the sin of the spies. This story underscores the intense rivalry between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees were the rabbis who, after the fall of the temple, rebuilt Judaism around prayer, study, and the oral law, which they said was given to Moses along with the written law. The Sadducees were priests, aristocrats, and wealthy farmers. They were powerful people and managers of the temple. They refused to accept the oral law, especially its teaching of an afterlife and the resurrection of the dead. And that's why they were sad, you see. The Sadducees were literalists, much like the Karaites who sprang up 1,000 years or so later. For them, if the Torah says Shabbat, it means Shabbat, not a holiday reinterpreted as a Shabbat. The Sadducees were very attached to the lands and the seasons, more so than the Pharisees. So they could not walk away from the agricultural meaning of Shavuot. They reasoned that after 7 exhausting weeks of harvest, the Jews needed a full weekend of rest. The Pharisees, thinking ahead, wanted a Judaism detached from the temple and the land of Israel, a Judaism that is portable and applicable in lands far away, where Jews would no longer be farmers and would therefore find Shavuot less meaningful. So they reinterpreted Shavuot to be a festival commemorating something of universal value, the giving of the Torah. They claim that this reinterpretation is in the oral law given to Moses. To be sure, the Pharisees did believe that the Jews would return to the land one day. They just wanted to be sure that the Jews stayed Jews until that day. Indeed, today, the Jews of Israel celebrate both the giving of the Torah and the harvest on Shavuot. Now let's discuss the main bone of contention, the oral law. Jewish tradition says that God gave 2 sets of instructions at Sinai, the written law, Torah Shebiketav, which he dictated to Moses, and the oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, in which he gave Moses all the details necessary to observe the written law in full. God said that the oral law should be passed down only orally through the generations. It must never be written down. The Talmud says, quote, teachings given orally may not be written down, and teachings given in writing may not be recited by heart. So the written law, the Torah, must be transmitted in writing only. That's why the Torah must be read from a scroll at services, even if the reader knows it by heart. Why did God not allow the oral law to be written down? Many reasons have been offered. First, the Midrash says, when Moses received the oral law, he said to God, Master of the universe, I will write it down for Israel. God said to him, I do not wish to give it to them in writing, because idolaters are destined to rule over them and will take it from them, and they will be despised among the idolaters. Rather, I will give them the Torah itself in writing, but I will give them Mishnah, Talmud, and Agadah orally. So if the idolaters come to them and subjugate them, they will be distinct from them. End of quote. So by preventing Gentiles from learning the details of Jewish observance, we prevent its being distorted or used against us. For this reason, the sages did not even want the written Torah translated, but the Greeks forced them to do it. The Talmud says, quote, the day the Torah was translated into Greek was as ominous for Israel as the day on which the golden calf was made, because the Torah cannot be accurately translated. End of quote. This translation, known as the Septuagint, became the basis for later religions to claim that their practitioners were the true Israelites. Second, the Talmud also says that keeping the oral law oral forces you to learn it directly from Torah scholars, not from books. By spending time with the scholars, you get more than just information. You tacitly learn valuable lessons on life. Writing down the oral law reduces the need for this important face-to-face relationship. The oral law itself says, Aseh lecha rav, find yourself a teacher. Learning from books is not enough. Third, Maimonides writes that what remains oral produces less controversy because there is no official text to refer to. Quote, if the law had been kept oral, it would have averted the evils which happened subsequently, namely great diversity of opinion, doubts as to the meaning of written words, slips of the pen, dissensions among the people, formation of new sects, and confused notions about practical subjects. Unquote. Fourth, languages evolve. A document written 3,500 years ago may not be fully understandable to modern people. But if the document is kept oral, each generation will substitute in modern words for the previous one, so people can understand. The real meaning thus would be kept alive with no uncertainty. Fifth, human memory being imperfect, oral transmission will let tiny changes slip down the generations. These will also reflect the ethical and spiritual evolution of Judaism. These changes are much harder to make if oral teachings are written down. Thus, a ban on writing allows an easier evolution in interpretation. Eventually, however, the oral law was written down for the greater good. The wars against Rome resulted in the death of huge numbers of rabbis and in the Romans prohibiting the teaching of Judaism. This convinced Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi early in the 3rd century to write down the oral law so it would not be lost. He called it the Mishnah. A long commentary on the Mishnah followed, called the Gemara or Talmud. It was finalized in the late 5th century. Jewish law since then has been based on this Talmud. Here are some examples of the oral law. The Torah prohibition of boiling a calf in its mother's milk means that we must not eat meat and dairy products together, that we must have 2 sets of dishes, one for dairy and one for meat, and that we must wait 6 hours after eating meat before we can eat dairy. The Torah injunction, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, means only financial compensation. If somebody pokes out your eye, you may not poke out his eye in return, but he must pay you a fair amount of money. This benefits you more than him losing an eye. The Torah quotes God as saying that kosher animals must be slaughtered, quote, as I have instructed you, unquote. But nowhere in the Torah is this instruction described. So God must have described it elsewhere. The rabbis see this as one proof for the existence of an oral law. However, Mishnah and Talmud don't just say, this is the oral law, do this and don't do that. They present long and detailed discussions among prominent rabbis about the pros and cons of each possible interpretation of a verse in the Torah. The law is then decreed by majority vote in the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a body of 71 elders that decided Jewish practice until the year 425, when the Romans disbanded it. Why did the rabbi claim these decisions were revealed to Moses by God when they are presented as human decisions? One answer is that after the huge human losses of the 2 revolts against Rome, the few surviving sages struggled to remember the oral law as they learned it from their dead masters, and frequently disagreed or were not familiar with all its aspects. All they could do was pool their imperfect recollections and hope to retrieve the law by majority votes after discussions. So what happened to the Sadducees in the end? They slowly disappeared as a sect in Jewish life when the center of their power, the Second Temple, was destroyed. Those who were priests saw their role in Judaism greatly diminished because most of their work was tied to the temple. Those who were wealthy landowners lost their lands. Those close to the king's court were sidelined when the Romans dispensed with the Jewish vassal king and ruled Judea directly. And most importantly, the common people's affections were squarely with the Pharisees, the rabbis. Judaism had turned a page. Chag Shavuot Sameach.